Hello, welcome to another episode of RestorationCast.
Glad to have you with us. We are glad to have you with us.
Yeah, so you might notice if you are not living in the United States and you're watching this right now, you might notice that this is, what, is it an hour later or an hour before it usually is?
I think it's an hour before.
Yeah, it should be, because we sprung forward.
We sprung forward. Weird laws here in America. We are really hoping that Elon Musk will get a hold of this. Richest man in the world. Surely, if anybody can change time, it would be Elon Musk.
Yeah.
We got these daylight savings things happening, and I realize some people like it, but I'm telling you, it messes with everything. Everything.
Yeah, it does. I think last semester was the first time I understood it in any fashion at all, because I was getting up to go to school. I had an 8 o'clock class, and so I would get up before sunrise to go to school, and I really thought, well, we're about to have daylight savings time, so we'll go a whole hour forward, and I'll be able to get up after sunrise, and it wasn't quite enough.
Wasn't quite enough.
To actually help.
That might be the most profound thing I've ever heard about daylight savings time. It's not quite enough.
Yeah, exactly. So
I suffered this morning. There was suffering in my heart this morning when I had to get out of bed. I lost an hour and I didn't like it. So go ahead.
At the same time, it's 7 o'clock right now, and the sun hasn't gone down.
The sun has not gone down. And by the time we get to midsummer, it'll be almost 9 o'clock here, and it'll be still daylight outside, son.
Yeah, that's true.
That's true, isn't it? They tell me that you're going to go to Panama.
That's true. I am going to go to Panama in 2 weeks, I guess.
Do they have daylight savings time in Panama?
I don't remember. I don't. I think maybe they do, because there's like the thing about it. Okay, is all of them. Like most of the Central American countries are in the same time zone that we are. And
Arkansas is.
Yes.
Okay.
At least the ones that I've been to.
Yeah.
I think. Unless I'm getting all of this wrong.
No,
I know Honduras is.
Yeah, because when you go to Honduras, there's like no time difference. We don't have to worry. When you went to Europe, we had to get up in the middle of the night to talk to you and stuff like that, but not Honduras.
Yeah, but the problem is Honduras doesn't have daylight savings time.
Oh, so they don't keep up.
So we're in the time zone, or the same time zone, but like whenever I was there, we went right around this time, and so for the first month that we were there, we were on the same time zone, and then
that's right.
We sprung forward, and all
we
of a sudden, it was an hour off.
Yeah, that's right. How is that trip going to affect our broadcast every Sunday night?
So what we're going to have to do is we're going to pre-record these, and we'll put them up on Facebook where they already are. I assume you put them up.
But not next week. We'll still be live next week.
We will still be live next week, but then for 2 weeks after that, because I have a preaching engagement the next Sunday.
My son, the busy minister that he is.
Yeah, so we will have, obviously, tonight, next Sunday night, and then for the next 2, it'll be pre-recorded.
2 pre-recorded. Because that's what we're doing.
Yes, it is what we're doing.
You're a busy young man, son. I'll tell you what. I'm really proud of you. And on top of this, you're going to school. Of course, the spring break trip is a mission trip to Panama, and it's through a guy that you met at school, one of the previous dudes that we love so much.
I guess I met him at school.
You never had him in a class,
I have never had.
Great guy, Art. He's like a legend in our area. But so you're going to go to Panama, and then later in the summer, it looks like you're going to go back to Honduras and maybe even Guatemala.
Yeah, that's the plan.
Amazing. They tell me there's a Methodist church on the way out to the college. This is our segue.
There is a Methodist church on the way to the college.
What's it called?
It's called Shiloh.
Oh, yeah, the Shiloh Methodist Church.
I pass it every day.
We were sitting at supper a minute ago, and Gabriel and I were talking about how can we use our intro to actually introduce the topic. So we manipulated that a little bit.
Yes. So The Methodist Church has nothing to do with the topic today,
Nothing.
other than the fact that they have the same name.
Shiloh.
But yeah, so if you hadn't guessed, we're talking about Shiloh tonight.
Shiloh. I'm kind of excited. I don't know really much about Shiloh, to be honest with you.
Well, there's not actually a lot to know.
Well,
about
there you
Shiloh.
go. That's why I don't.
So that probably has something to do with it. But yeah, so looking. Oh wait, questions. I forget.
Yeah, don't get ahead of yourself, son.
These are the questions that you're going to answer and whatnot. So.
Restoration School of Biblical Studies, people. Screenshot that, fill in the blanks as we go along, and you'll be ready for the final test. I can't tell you the number of times I've said that over the years. People get tired of hearing me say it, but you never know. Somebody new's tuning in, they need to know what in the world.
That's true. You never do know.
All right.
But if they were tuning in, would they be a student that needs to take pictures of this?
Probably not.
Anyway, so there's your questions.
Shiloh. Here's the history.
Yeah, so the history of Shiloh, first of all, it's where the tabernacle was set up. So once the children of Israel come into the land, right, they come in and they conquer the land, and then they have to have a place to put the tabernacle.
Right.
So Shiloh is the place that it ends up. It kind of seems like it was probably at Shechem first, and then by the end of the book of Joshua, it gets moved to Shiloh for some reason. It's also where Joshua was whenever he divided the land up, which the reason for that is God was actually the one that was doing the dividing, right? So he would cast lots over by the tabernacle, and then God would pick out where they should put their markers and divide up the land for the 12 tribes.
Well, question then, and maybe you're going to cover this later, so just scrap it if you are, but so Joshua did this at Shiloh because the tabernacle was already there. Not the tabernacle was there because this is where they're going to divide up the land.
I actually don't know.
I've always wondered why Shiloh. Are we going to deal with that at all?
Not really, because I don't know.
Yeah.
It just seems to be kind of that's where they put the tabernacle.
Just happened to be at the moment, so.
Yeah, and so, but yeah, they set up the tabernacle there, and it kind of seems like, I don't know. I mean, Shiloh just becomes like this important place for a time because the tabernacle is there, but it doesn't seem to give any indication of why Shiloh or any of those different things. It just put the tabernacle here, and so. I think it's very similar to Jerusalem, right? There's not a lot that makes Jerusalem an important city, other than the fact that at one point David was like, "Hey, I'm going to put the capital city here," and here we are. It's like the most important city in the world, and so you kind of have that idea. I think of what's going on here is there's not really a reason that it's important, other than somebody at one point decided it was. I mean, that's how most things are, right? I mean, it's what makes money valuable is the fact that at one point we kind of decided.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
This is valuable.
I got a little piece of paper. Who says that that's really worth $20?
Yeah, and supposedly it's backed up by something, but then we also made that thing valuable, right? Gold, right? It's historically been valuable all this time, and so we kind of say, well, it has actual value because it's been valuable for forever. But then at the same time, what is it that actually makes gold valuable?
Because people want it.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I think with Shiloh, the thing that I'm going to be curious to find out as we're going to move through this is it seemed like there are several really important stories that take place at Shiloh, but if I was a novice in Scripture, I would just assume that's happening in Jerusalem because most all the big stuff happens in Jerusalem, the temple, all that kind of thing. So anyhow, I'm going to turn it back over to you, son.
Yeah. So Shiloh's actually pretty short-lived as far as the history goes. So Joshua divides the land at Shiloh. The tabernacle is there. Last week we talked about the story when they kill all the Benjamites.
Yeah.
A lot of the Benjamites, and then they have to go and steal wives. And they're stealing the daughters of Shiloh, right? So the girls that are living in Shiloh is the people that they're kidnapping.
Wow.
Why Shiloh? I don't know.
And the tabernacle is there at that point.
Yeah.
So they're stealing the daughters around the tabernacle.
Yeah, which kind of seems to be the idea, because what's going on is like they're having this feast, and then the daughters, or the women at Shiloh go out to dance, basically, and then the guys come in.
They come grab one. She's dancing really good. I want that one.
Yeah, that seems to be kind of the idea.
Really?
So I think the fact that the tabernacle is there kind of has something to do with the whole idea. So yeah, you have that, and then Shiloh is destroyed shortly after the Ark of the Covenant is stolen from.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, so that we're going to look at the story right before that tonight. But kind of what happens is the children of Israel go out to battle with the Philistines, right? And I guess they go out and they lose once. And so they say, all right, let's bring out the Ark of the Covenant, right? God will fight for us. He'll solve this problem. And so they bring out the Ark of the Covenant. And they're kind of doing this as, like, thinking that the Ark of the Covenant's some kind of magical totem or something.
Right.
That they can bring it out and it will solve all their problems for them. But God looks at them and he's like, that's not the respect I deserve. Whereas the Philistines see the Ark of the Covenant and they're like, oh man, these are the gods that destroyed Egypt. They parted the Red Sea. They destroyed Og, the king of Moab. They've done all of these great things, and so they're like quaking in their boots, giving God the respect that he deserves. And so God lets the Philistines win the battle. And
wow.
Yeah, so then they steal the Ark of the Covenant, and it doesn't actually say that Shiloh's destroyed at that time, but other places seem to infer, I guess, the idea that Shiloh was destroyed at this point.
We kind of do the same thing today with regards to our church buildings. If you think about it, that they're this kind of this magical context that there are a lot of denominations, but I'm thinking of one specifically where you got to get into that building, and you got to bow as you approach the altar, and you got to light candles, and you got to, because this is the sanctuary of God, and it almost becomes, like you say, that magic totem that we present as the authority that if I get in here, then I got to be safe.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously the idea of reverence,
sure,
is a good thing.
Absolutely.
But then at the same time, you're right. What they're doing here is they're trying to manipulate God.
Exactly.
Right? And so they say, we're going to, do these acts of worship so that you will do something for me.
Yeah, and if I can get God trapped in a particular building, then it makes it easier on me to know where to find God.
Yeah.
I don't have to take him with me every day.
Yeah, I think sometimes we think of prayer in the same way, right? We'll tack on, in Jesus' name, amen, at the end of the prayer, and we think that means, well, now he's got to do it.
He got to do it.
He's got to do what I said because, I use Jesus' name.
Exactly.
At the end of the prayer. And that's not how that works, obviously. The idea of praying in Jesus' name doesn't mean you say Jesus' name at the end. It actually means, I'm doing this by the authority of Jesus, almost representing Jesus, right? And so the idea is I'm praying something that I think Jesus would want me to pray.
Good point.
Right. So yeah, they do that thing. They try to manipulate God into helping them in this battle, and it goes so horribly wrong that the Ark of the Covenant is stolen, and it's implied in other places that Shiloh is destroyed. What we do know is the Ark never actually returns to Shiloh.
I didn't know that.
So it's going to eventually end up in Jerusalem,
right?
And the temple, obviously. So they do get the Ark of the Covenant back. God takes care of that himself. But it's not going to end up in Shiloh ever again.
Indiana Jones found it later.
Yeah.
And their faces melted off when they opened it up. I saw the movie.
I've also seen that movie.
Well, I just want to make sure we bring clarity to
I was a little kid at the time, and you wouldn't let me watch the scene where their faces melt off. So I mean, Indiana Jones didn't watch that part either.
That's true. He told the woman that he was
Yeah.
tied to, don't be looking over there, because you're,
Yeah.
They didn't have their faces melt off.
Their faces did not melt off.
But let's get back to reality.
Yeah. So it's also, this is a weird one. So this is Jeremiah chapter 41.
Okay.
There's these men, 10 men from Shiloh and Shechem,
okay.
That go, and they go to this guy named Ishmael. This is Ishmael, the son of Nethaniah.
Not Ishmael, the son of Abraham.
Yeah, not that one, because this is Jeremiah. So this is.
I'm just trying to make sure we clarify.
This is the end of the Old Testament. The other Ishmael is the beginning. But yes. So basically, they go to this guy because they want to see this other guy named Gedaliah, who is the governor of Israel that the Babylonians have put in place. Oh. And Ishmael has just murdered Gedaliah. Yeah. I remember this. So he kills most of the 10 guys from Shiloh. He actually spares some of them because they're like, we got grain and stuff we could give you if you spare our lives. And so he does spare some of them, and then he flees to the Ammonites.
And isn't this the reason they get all scared that what's going to happen? And so they go to Jeremiah and say, what do we do? Jeremiah says, I'll talk to God. God says, whatever you do, don't go to Egypt. And so they go to Egypt. Right?
I think so.
I think that's his story. I preached through Jeremiah one time.
You have.
I even wrote a little book. The Jeremiah Generation. Do you remember?
I do remember that one. Yeah.
Anyhow,
I'm not sure if I ever read it. But...
Well, we don't need to announce that right here publicly for people.
I'm sorry. I was a little kid when this book came out, so it was a little beyond my reading comprehension at that point. But anyway, that's where the story of Shiloh ends. Right? There's
right there.
Yeah, there's very little that actually happens at Shiloh. It's kind of odd because it's clearly a very important place, right? But then there's not really that much that goes on.
There is one story I'm hoping you're going to get to there that
we'll see
has some decent depth to it.
Maybe we will.
Okay.
It depends on if it's the story that I'm thinking of.
I hope so, because that's the reason I said earlier on. There's some important stuff that happened at Shiloh. You know what I'm saying? And I didn't have this stuff in mind at all. Oh. All right, we're going to see who gets made to look like the goofball here. Go, man.
All right. So the first time Shiloh is mentioned in Scripture is actually not Joshua 18:1. It kind of is, because it's mentioned one other time, but it's half of another name, and it's just like them like marking out the territory of the land. And so I decided I was going to skip straight to the second time.
Going to the second time.
But Joshua 18:1 says, Then the whole congregation of the people of Israel assembled at Shiloh and set up the tent of meeting there. The land lay subdued before them.
Now this is going to be, if I'm right, Gabriel, Shiloh is going to be what will become the area of Samaria.
Yeah.
Because here's Shiloh. Here's Jerusalem. Up here, we're going to have Nazareth, the Sea of Galilee. And so Shiloh, I don't know that it's directly in between, but it seems like it'd be almost halfway. Mm-hmm. I don't. Your map cuts us off, so I don't know.
Yeah, it's. If you look at the little tiny map up there.
That's a good point. Yeah, that's a good point.
It's a little bit.
Not quite halfway.
It's not quite halfway, but yeah,
closer to Jerusalem.
It's something along those lines. But yeah, so they all gather at Shiloh, and again, this is what we were talking about earlier. This idea that they come together, and this is the place where they divide out the land. And I point this out basically to say, obviously, Shiloh is this important place, right? Sure. Because they all gather together to put the tabernacle up at this place. So this is where God's presence is dwelling during a large large time.
Which is a big deal because, I mean, up to this point, the whole push has been get us to the promised land, get us to the promised land. When we get there, we're going to have, homes and, and then they do the 40 years wandering.
Mm-hmm.
It's all been about, let's get, now what are we going to do, Joshua? All right, God's going to say, here's where you, oh, Martha, look at the land we get to have, that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. As a matter of fact, Shiloh, I guess the tabernacle being in Shiloh is such a big deal that later on in the book of Judges, at one point they set up an idol, and what it says about the idol is it was set up as long as the Ark of the Covenant was in Shiloh. Right? So it kind of has this historical precedence of the fact that the Ark of God is there. It's at Shiloh. And then kind of the last mention, it's not really the last mention again, but kind of where this whole thing goes by the end of the story is Jeremiah chapter 7, verses 12 through 14 says, "Go now to my place that was in Shiloh, where I made my name dwell at first, and see what I did to it because of the evil of my people Israel. And now, because you have done all these things, declares the Lord, and when I spoke to you persistently, you did not listen, and when I called you, you did not answer. Therefore, I will do to the house that is called by my name, and in which you trust, and to the place that I gave to you and to your fathers, as I did to Shiloh."
Wow.
Right? So Shiloh starts off as this really this great place, right? This place where God is, where his tabernacle is, and then pretty quickly it goes downhill, and because of the sins of the people of Israel, God destroys Shiloh. And so it becomes kind of a byword.
Yeah, it's kind of a threat. You're going to be like Shiloh, almost like we would say Sodom and Gomorrah.
Yeah, exactly. And so you have this idea that it seems to be talking about Jerusalem here, but that God says, I'm going to do to Jerusalem the same thing that I did to Shiloh, which makes a lot of sense, right?
Yeah.
That Shiloh and Jerusalem have a lot of things in common. Jerusalem is the place where the temple is, so it is kind of the new Shiloh,
right.
And yet God says, if you don't repent, you don't straighten up and fly right, I'm going to do to Jerusalem the same thing that I did to Shiloh, which really leads us into, I guess, the theme of our story tonight, which is that there are certain people that God exalts, right?
Okay.
And there are certain other people that God destroys, like Shiloh. So the book of, really, the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, which would have been originally just the book of Samuel, but they're really, this major theme in them is who is it that God is going to put in power, right? It's all about kind of these shifts in power, and we see that with Shiloh, right? So in the beginning of the book of 1 Samuel, you have Shiloh as this very prominent place, and then it really quickly loses its prominence, and then by the end, Jerusalem has taken over for Shiloh. So you have this shift in power dynamics. That's basically what this book is all about. You've got Shiloh to Jerusalem is one of them. You've got Saul and David is really the big one, right?
Yeah.
That's the one that we talk most about. Samuel and Eli,
sure,
is the one we're going to talk about tonight. And then you also have the idea of Samuel's mother, Hannah,
mm-hmm.
And Elkanah, so Hannah's husband. He has this other wife whose name is Peninnah, which is it's a funny name. But you kind of have the same idea with them, right? So as the story begins, essentially what happens is Peninnah has children.
Right.
And Hannah doesn't have any children, which, it's a big deal
back then, huge.
During this time period. I feel like it would still be a big deal now, if polygamy was a thing.
Sure. You're right. No, I think you're right.
we don't do that in
Don't
America,
do that.
except maybe in Utah.
You're not supposed to.
But anyway, so but yeah, it's like this is a big deal that this one wife has children and the other wife doesn't. You can see that in Genesis, right? With
Jacob,
yeah, Leah and Rachel like have this big
big deal.
like knockout drag out fight over which of them has kids and which of them doesn't.
Or even trading mandrakes for conjugal rights.
Yes, that does happen.
We're going to keep it PG though. Continue.
Yeah. So this is a really big deal, and then basically Hannah goes and she prays to God,
which is cool.
Yeah.
I just go to God about this.
Yeah, and so she says to God this thing that I think I don't know that we typically do this. You see this a lot on TV, but like she makes this promise to God that if you do this thing for me, I'm going to do this other thing for you, right? You kind of see this like with the idea of like, God, if you'll save this person's life, then I will, like, I'll, I don't know,
enter the priesthood.
Yeah, something like that.
We see that on TV,
Yeah, and so she makes this promise that if God gives her a son, she will dedicate that son to him, that he will enter the priesthood, right? And that's what happens. So Hannah does have this son. She has Samuel, and then he goes, after he's weaned, and he goes and lives at the temple, or the tabernacle rather, with Eli, and basically is trained to become a priest, which at the beginning of the story it says that they're from Ephraim, so some people question like how can Samuel become a priest if he's not from the tribe of Levi, but what that actually means is he lives in Ephraim, but he is a Levite, just to clarify.
Appreciate that clarity.
Anyway, so you have that idea, right? So Hannah becomes exalted over Peninnah because God does it, right? So it's about not who is better, really, but rather who is it that God is going to exalt. And then Hannah even says this, right? So in the beginning of 1 Samuel chapter 2, she prays this really beautiful prayer. And one of the things, really, most of what she talks about is this idea that God exalts the humble and he brings down the prideful, the arrogant. And that's basically what's going to be taught, what's going to be demonstrated throughout the rest of the book of 1 Samuel. So what we kind of see is that the idea of being humble here is really the idea of respecting God. Right? So Proverbs chapter 9, verse 10 says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is insight." Right? So we have this idea of like it's a good thing to fear God, which is kind of an odd thing. I don't think most of us fear is a little bit odd of a word, and this definitely means respect.
Certainly.
Right? I think there's a little bit more to it than that. That there is sort of also this idea of fear.
I agree.
In it, but I think the idea of respect does kind of capture it. Maybe have reverence for God would be a better idea there. More clear. But that's the idea. Is like, do you have this respect for God, or don't you?
Yeah, I think the American church really lacks that. I think that we have gone to the other extreme of being more comfortable with God. Mm-hmm. Not that we should be necessarily fearful in the sense of I just don't even want to go there. Like the children of Israel at Mount Sinai, I don't think that God's calling us to that. But I do think that there is a level of respect that causes you to really give self-consideration as you approach this person. Not unlike going before your grandfather with a Bible question, recognizing this is a man who's got all this experience under his belt, and I don't want to look dumb, and I don't want to presume, and so you go respectfully. You don't fear him, but at the same time, you understand the positions, the difference in positions there.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so you've got this idea of respecting God, and what you immediately see in the book of Samuel, uh, if you're paying attention, I guess, is that Samuel's not actually a book about good guys versus bad guys. At the surface level, it seems like it is, but that's not really what it's about. Rather, Samuel is this story of people that respect God versus people that don't.
Hmm.
Right. So, at the
Yeah, good
story we
point.
told at the beginning, we talked about that idea of like the children of Israel bring out the Ark of the Covenant, right? And I think, without a doubt, can say yes, the children of Israel are the good guys, right? The children of Israel are the good guys. The Philistines are the bad guys.
Yeah.
And yet, the children of Israel are the ones that get beaten, right? And it seems like it's God that's doing this, right? God ordains them being defeated because even though they're kind of the good guys, they're the ones that aren't showing the proper level of respect to God.
And from their perspective, don't you think they would have said, "Hey, because we're taking the Ark of the Covenant, clearly we're respecting God."
Yeah.
But they weren't. They were respecting what they wanted from this, not what God should have as far as respecting His holiness.
Yeah, exactly. You can kind of see the same thing with like David and Saul, right? Saul does a few bad things, but he's really not that bad of a king until like really late into his career. The one thing he does that's really bad that gets the kingship taken away from him is he makes a sacrifice that only a priest is supposed to be able to make.
Good point.
And you can kind of say the same thing with that, right? That he does this because it seems he wants the blessing of God before he goes into battle.
Yeah.
Right. So you kind of say, well, didn't Saul do a good thing there?
Well, yeah. It seems to me like you come to that conclusion that he is respecting God by wanting to make sure I acknowledge God before I go into battle. The problem was it's not unlike Matthew 7, where it says that on the last days there'll be those who will say, "But Lord, Lord, did we not do da 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 da?" And he says at the end of that, "Depart from me, you evildoers." I mean, he doesn't just say, "I appreciate your effort." He doesn't say, "Well, you're lukewarm Christian." No, he says you're an evildoer because you didn't do what I said do. Respecting God isn't about you and me doing what we want, what we think, concocting our own denominational doctrines of what would be best, building our buildings in such a fashion so that we feel like that's what's going to get God's attention. It's not about that. It's about paying attention to what God says He wants.
Yeah, exactly. And so what you kind of see is David actually does go and do, quite a lot of bad stuff.
Yeah,
right.
When compared to Saul, of course we got a little more information, but yeah, you're right.
Yeah, and it seems like Saul is probably actually a bit better of a guy than David is, and yet David respects God.
Exactly.
And so, because of David's respect for God, that's the thing that makes him a good king over Saul, right? And so that's really the thing that we're looking at.
If we could just get that message, it's about your heart, and your, of course, the famous quote, that David is a man after God's own heart. You're right. That's the point. If Saul had just had the heart of God as the number one thing, imagine what he could have. I mean, he's the first king of Israel.
Yeah.
In fact, it's so much so disgusting, if you will, that when you ask somebody who's the first king of Israel, most novices will say David. That's how much Saul has become a footnote because he didn't respect God. I'm sorry. Go ahead. You got a bunch of statistics. I thought, what in the world?
Yeah. So, kind of what we're looking at with this lesson here is, of course, this idea of respecting God.
Okay.
But then you look at this passage in Proverbs talking about the fear of the Lord, and it says specifically the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom.
Yeah.
All right. So what we see throughout the story we're going to read, which is 1 Samuel chapter 3.
Okay.
What we see throughout this story is that God is going to give Samuel insight. Right? He's going to teach Samuel about what ought to be done and all of those different things. And so if we want to be the kinds of people that have wisdom, the kinds of people that have insights from God, then the place that starts is with a healthy respect,
Mm.
a fear of God.
Okay.
So, uh, according to my research, we make 36,000 decisions every day,
Whoa.
which is 252,000 decisions a week.
Mm.
13,104,000 decisions every year, which is one decision every 2.5 seconds.
2.5 seconds.
Yes.
I am going to pick up my water and drink from it. Just made another one of my 36,000 decisions.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a lot of decisions that we make that we don't even realize we're making.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So we'll be going about our everyday lives, and then we make decisions constantly. Right. I don't recognize 36,000 of the decisions that I make every day, but apparently I do make them. Not actually sure how you measure this.
Yeah, I was kind of wondering how their metric worked there, but I can see that though if you think about it. That you just, and some of it subconsciously you decide, some of it's intentional, but it's just kind of almost a natural reaction to various things. Somebody puts out their hand, you decide that you're going to put out your hand to shake theirs, but you don't really decide it. I don't sit there and, now, should I shake his hand or not? Unless you're Monk.
Yeah.
Remember Monk? He didn't shake hands.
I do remember.
But yeah, that's interesting statistic. That's a lot of decisions.
Yeah, and so because of the sheer number of decisions we make, and you don't recognize that we're making, I think that demonstrates how much more important the decisions that we actually do recognize we're making.
Good point. Yes,
are.
Very good point.
Right. So there are some decisions that we would just immediately recognize this is a big, important decision. Right. I'm going to buy a house, then that's a lot of money that I'm sinking into this project, and so that's a big decision of what house am I going to buy. Same thing maybe with a car.
Sure.
Where you're going to go to school, the person that you're going to marry, the job that you're going to have. There's a lot of decisions that we would say these are big decisions, and if we make 13 million decisions every year, then I think the 2 or 3 really big decisions we make every year, that those become immediately like far more important.
I agree.
Because we're making a lot of decisions that we don't even think about.
Yeah.
And yet, for some reason, I thought about this one. And so, what this lesson is about is that idea of there are these huge decisions that we make, and we need someone who's a lot wiser than us to help us in those moments of how do I make good decisions, right? And the problem that we have a lot of times is that we have decisions that aren't like there's no right answer, I guess. Yeah. Which house am I supposed to buy? There's not like a more moral house to buy,
right? Unless
you're like, I could buy this really expensive house, or I could buy this not expensive house and give the money to the poor. Or, there's some of that, but a lot of decisions we make don't have actual like moral ramifications.
Right.
They're 2 good options, and I have to decide which of these options is best. And it's really at those moments, I think, that we need this level of guidance from God. And Proverbs chapter 9 says the way that we get that guidance is, it starts by respecting, fearing God.
Yeah, and if you think about that, if you have a respect for God, even the other lesser, more minor decisions throughout the day and throughout the year and those kind of things, they are going to reflect that respect almost from a, like you say, an instinctive, it becomes more of your lifestyle. But all of that, as you're pointing out, all of that really is going to come to the forefront, climax in some of these big decisions that we make. And they are the ones that really kind of reflect upon the other, parts that are lesser, if you will.
Yeah. And the other thing is the more you recognize this power that each of your decisions has, that's the more you're going to recognize that little decisions also matter, right? You're going to reach this moment, these points eventually, whenever even the little decisions that you make are going to reflect this respect that you have for God. So if you respect God, He will direct your path.
That's a big application.
Yeah.
I want that.
So looking at the story of 1 Samuel chapter 3.
Chapter 3.
My picture didn't come up.
No picture for Dad. Right here, there's a picture. Do we need it?
No, we don't, but it was a picture of the tabernacle.
Tabernacle's
so
right
just
here.
imagine a tabernacle right there. But anyway, so 1 Samuel chapter 3 is God is calling to Samuel. And what we immediately recognize as we look at Samuel is that he is the kind of person that respects God.
I wonder where he got that at this age.
Probably his mother.
Had a good mom.
Yeah, and so, but we see this idea that he is the kind of person that respects God, especially in contrast to Eli's two sons, who were not respecters of God. And so the first thing that we see from this story is if we want to be the kinds of people that respect God, the way that we do that is by drawing near to God. Right? So 1 Samuel chapter 3, verses 1 through 3 says, Now the boy Samuel was ministering to the Lord in the presence of Eli, and the word of the Lord was rare in those days. There was no frequent vision. At that time, Eli, whose eyesight had begun to grow dim so that he could not see, was lying down in his own place. The lamp of God had not yet gone out. And Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord where the ark of God was.
Can you imagine?
Yeah, so we have this idea that, immediately, right out the gate of this chapter, the place where Samuel is sleeping is where God is.
Oh, wow.
Right? And so later on, we're going to find out Samuel doesn't actually know God at this point. Right? It says God hadn't visited Samuel until now, so Samuel doesn't really know who God is.
Right.
And yet Samuel is right here sleeping in God's presence. And so the first thing we get from this is if we want to be people that respect God, the first thing we need to do is spend time with Him. We need to be around God. So what Samuel is doing here, inadvertently, is something that's called incubation, which is it is something that you do to eggs.
I'm aware of that one.
But I
didn't know you do it to people.
Yes, in the ancient Near East, there is this process called incubation, which basically means that they would go into this holy place.
Okay.
Right, this place where this deity is supposed to be, and they typically would offer sacrifices first of all, and then they would sleep there, and theoretically the deity should visit them in a dream. So if you remember the story of Solomon, right, whenever he asks for wisdom, that's actually what he does, is he goes up to a high place, he sacrifices to God, and then he sleeps there.
Yeah, Jacob did the same thing.
Yeah, and then God visits him in a dream. So Bethel, right? The reason Jacob marks Bethel is because he has this dream in which God visits him, and he basically says, "Oh, this must be where God lives."
So right? The house of God.
Yeah, exactly.
Bethel.
And so you kind of have this idea that they would have thought this thing would happen. That if you draw near to God, He will draw near to you. That idea, but. If you are in God's presence, that something will happen to you.
You need to go incubate.
Right, yeah, exactly. And that's what Samuel is doing, but not on purpose.
Right.
Right, because later on, Samuel's going to run out and he's going to think that Eli's the one that's calling him.
Right.
Not God.
But it is purposeful from Mom's standpoint. Mom put him in the incubation process. He doesn't understand all but I think there's a huge application there that I don't want us to slip over. Moms and dads, parents, you've got the opportunity to incubate your kids in the presence. I struggle with that, but you're the one who brought it up. But the less incubation time they have in God's presence, the less likely it is they're going to discover God.
Yeah.
And so you've got to govern their day. Deuteronomy chapter 6, the Shema, read it for yourself. Gabriel.
Yeah, so we have this idea of if we go into the presence of God, spending time with God is one of the ways that we learn this respectful attitude towards God, right? And that's exactly what Samuel does. Is he apparently is constantly spending time in the temple, right here in the presence of God. And so the way that we do this as Christians is number one, spend time with other Christians, right? So Matthew 18:20. It's the idea of where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, that's where I am, right? So spending time with Christians, and that's more than just like go to church on Sunday mornings, right? That is spend time with like-minded people, like as often as you get the opportunity, right? That go out to coffee with fellow Christians, or eat dinner with them as often as you have the opportunity. Spend time with other Christians.
Acts 2, they were doing it daily.
Yeah, exactly. And so, that's the idea is if you want Jesus to be in your presence, you want to spend time with God, then spend time with other Christians, because he says that's where he is going to be. The other thing is look for God everywhere.
That's good.
So on Sunday afternoons, we have home church, and that's one thing that we always stop to talk about is, where did you see God this week, right? How has God impacted your life this week? And what that does is it makes it to where we're all looking out for God. Right? We're looking to see, where is God moving in my life? And you can kind of just say, like, everywhere, right? Like, I don't think there is really a place that God isn't at work in our lives. And yet you have this moment of, but where do I recognize it? Where do I actually see that God is at work in my life? And so those are 2 things that you can do to have this idea of like drawing near to God.
Spend time with God's people and look for God wherever you go.
Yeah, exactly. And what that does is, whenever we draw near to God, those are moments whenever God actually helps us to make decisions. I said the James passage, draw near to God and he'll draw near to you. And so I think there's moments whenever we have problems in our life and we try with our own strength to tackle those problems. All right. I try to fix my own sin problem on my own. But what we really need to be doing is we need to be drawing near to God, right? And he will help us to take care of those sin problems, but not if we're trying to do it on our own. Right. So you have this idea of learning to respect God by being in God's presence.
Incubating.
And then you also have the idea of learning to respect God by learning to respect other people.
Okay.
All right. So Samuel is sleeping there in the temple, or the tabernacle rather. So right there in the presence of God. And then God basically appears to Samuel. Right. He appears to Samuel, and he says Samuel's name, and Samuel thinks that this is Eli calling to him, as we mentioned before. So he goes and he asks Eli, why are you calling for me? Why did you need, Eli? And Eli says, it wasn't me. Go back to bed. He does this 3 times.
Yeah.
Finally, the 3rd time, he goes back to Eli, and this is what it says. Now Eli was very old, and oh wait, I'm sorry. Let me skip ahead in my slides. So, and the Lord called Samuel again the 3rd time. There we go. And he arose and went to Eli and said, here I am, for you called me. Then Eli perceived that the Lord was calling the boy. Therefore Eli said to Samuel, go lie down, and if he calls you, you shall say, speak, Lord, for your servant hears. So Samuel went and lay down in his place, and the Lord came and stood, calling as at other times, Samuel, Samuel. And Samuel said, speak, for your servant hears. Right? So Eli gives Samuel this advice, and Samuel actually goes and he does the thing that Eli said. Now contrast this with Eli's sons, which is
why you had that.
Why I had this.
That makes sense now.
So, chapter 2, verses 22 through 26 says, now Eli was very old, and he kept hearing all that his sons were doing to all Israel. how they lay with the women who were serving at the entrance to the tent of meeting. And he said to them, "Why do you do such things? For I hear of your evil dealings from all these people. No, my sons, it is no good report that I hear the people of the Lord spreading abroad. If someone sins against a man, God will mediate for him. But if someone sins against the Lord, who can intercede for him?" But they would not listen to the voice of their father, for it was the will of God to put them to death. Now the boy Samuel continued to grow in stature and in favor with the Lord and also with man.
Sounds like that passage about Jesus.
It does sound like that passage. In fact, it's almost exactly the same thing it says about Jesus. But I mean, this is really interesting, right? That it clearly, if you read chapter 2, it is purposefully contrasting Eli's sons with Samuel.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It mentions Eli's sons 2 or 3 times, and then immediately switches back to Samuel, and it's like, but Samuel's a good kid.
Yeah.
All right. And so, like, it's clearly doing this thing, and this is just one instance. But notice what it says. Right? It says that Eli hears what's going on, and he tries to stop this thing from happening. Right? He tries to correct his sons, and so he goes and he gives them advice.
Right.
He says to them, "Stop, because I'm hearing this bad report of you," and they will not listen. Now, part of the reason it says they won't listen is because God won't let them listen, because they've already gone too far with all of this.
But that's
this
because
saying.
they weren't listening prior to it. They'd already
exactly
calloused their own hearts.
Yeah, and so they come to this point where they have gone too far with their not listening thing. And then it immediately contrasts it with Samuel.
Yeah.
It says, now, the boy Samuel grew in favor with God and man, right? It says the same thing about Samuel that it says about Jesus.
And when Eli gives Samuel advice on what to do that night, Samuel doesn't say, "Well, I'm too sleepy. I'm just going back to bed and ignoring the voice." He knows. Eli said, "Do it." So he goes and "Lord, I'm here. What do you want?"
Yeah, exactly. And so I think kind of the idea here is that the way that we learn to respect God, the way that we learn to love God, is by loving and respecting other people. Right? And you can kind of see this in Matthew chapter 25.
Okay.
So that's the story whenever Jesus is talking about the end times, right? The sheep and the goats and all of that. And what he says is there's some people he's going to accept and some people he's going to turn away. And the thing he's going to say to them is, "I was hungry and you gave me food," or didn't. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was naked and you clothed me. You did all of these different things for me. And the good people will say, when did I do that? When did this happen? When did I see you hungry and give you something to eat, or thirsty, or naked? When did I do any of these things?
Because their motives are so in tune with God. It's like, when did I do that, Lord?
Yeah, exactly. And then Jesus says, "As often as you have done this to the least of these, you've done it to me." Right? And so what we see is God is hiding in plain sight.
Yes, right? Yes.
God is hiding in the character of other people that we see. And so whenever we come up and we see someone else, that's how we practice loving God.
Wow.
Is by going and loving our neighbor.
Yeah.
Right? And so that's the idea. And then, of course, Jesus reverses that, right? And he says to those people that didn't, feed and give water to and clothe the poor, he says, you didn't do all of these things to me because you didn't do it to the least of these. And so that's the idea here, is we learn to love other people. We learn to love God by loving other people.
Wow.
And I think that's kind of true in like just everyday life as well. That if we have somebody that we don't know, and yet we know of them, the way that we learn to love those people, I think, is by loving other people that we do know. Right? So, we have a lot of people that are watching this in other countries, and like we've never met those people.
Yeah. And
yet we hear good reports of them,
right?
And we hear good things about them, and those things remind us of people that we do know.
Yeah.
All right. And so by loving the people that we do know that we have right here, the people that we have met. By extension, I think we learn to love those people that have similar qualities in other places.
Excellent point.
And so that's another way that we learn to respect God is those two ways. Number one, we are in God's presence, right? We go into the presence of God, we seek Him out in whatever ways we can. And then number two, we learn to respect other people. And then, again, my picture didn't come up for some reason.
Oh.
But again, or then we come to this conclusion of the story, right? So Samuel finally does go and he talks to God, right? He goes back and he does what Eli told him to do. He says, "Speak, Lord, for your servant hears." And then God tells him what's going to happen.
Yeah.
God says that Eli's sons are going to be killed because of the wicked things that they have been doing. And so Samuel hears this and he sleeps the rest of the night, I guess. It says he lays down again. I feel like that would be a sleepless night, personally.
Yeah, I've been thinking about what you've been saying here. You know, if you open up in chapter 3 and 1, it calls Samuel a boy. The boy Samuel ministered, okay? And we're still in that same context. This is a lot to put on a little guy, if you think about it. You mentioned that he doesn't know God yet. He knows about godly stuff. He's working there in the tabernacle, but he doesn't know God. In fact, it even says that the word of God had been rare. Yeah. So, God's not showing up in that kind. And all of a sudden, this little boy is starting to get words from God. And the little boy that gets words from God is now burdened with this. I'll tell you what is going to happen. And he becomes prophetic in that God tells him what's going to happen in the future with regards to Eli, his sons, and all of these kind of things. That's a heavy load to put on a little guy.
Yeah, it is. And then the next morning, it seems to indicate Samuel doesn't want to tell Eli.
Yeah, who would?
He's got bad news, and so he doesn't want to say it to Eli. But Eli tells him, "Go ahead, tell me what God said." And so Samuel does.
Yeah.
Right? Samuel
speaks the truth.
Yeah, exactly. Samuel does what a prophet is supposed to do.
Which needs to be learned today. Sometimes the message you have to present as a minister is not comfortable for your people, but you got to present it because you are God's man. You're not the church's man. You're not your neighbor's man. You're God's man. And sometimes the message you have to present, it's not going to sit well, but it's still got to be presented.
Yeah, and so Samuel does. He goes and he presents this message to Eli, and then Eli basically says, it's the will of God that's going to happen, so there's not a lot I can do about it. And then the next thing it says is this, 1 Samuel 3:19-21. And Samuel grew, and the Lord was with him, and let none of his words fall to the ground. And all Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, knew that Samuel was established as a prophet of the Lord. The Lord appeared again at Shiloh. For the Lord revealed himself to Samuel at Shiloh by the word of the Lord.
Wow.
So basically what we discover is Samuel gets this revelation from God, right? He has God come and talk to him, and because he respects God, because he does well with this, there's a reversal that happens here. At the very beginning of the story, the first thing it says is the word of the Lord was rare in those times.
Yep.
And now it says, and God is revealing himself to Samuel.
Yeah. Right? My translation even says continued to appear. It's like,
yeah, so the word of the Lord is no longer rare. Right?
Yeah.
Because Samuel, he does the thing, right? Because he respects God, God blesses him with insight, right? If you respect God, he will direct your path. Samuel does that. He respects God.
Yep.
And so because of his respect for God, God directs his path. And so that's really the message for all of us.
Definitely.
Right? Is that we have the opportunity. Right? We have the opportunity to have our paths directed, to become wise people who make good decisions, right? 36,000 decisions a day, that we have the opportunity to make those well, right? We have the opportunity to be the kinds of people like Samuel that go out and have the message of God that we can present to other people.
Yeah.
And the way that we get that message, the way that we become wise, is by being the kinds of people that respect God.
Mm.
So we do that by looking for Him and everything, surrounding ourselves with people that are looking for Him. And we do that by learning to respect other people, right?
Yeah.
And so if we do all of those things like Samuel does, we learn to respect God, and He will direct our paths.
Well, that is so good. I love the phrase that I dance for an audience of one. I use that this morning in my sermon, as a matter of fact. But it's so apropos here, I think, in that my concern is what God thinks of me. Now, in the process of that, I'm going to have others think of me as well. But if I keep my focus on what's really important here, I was watching a flash mob the other day on one of the social media channels, and the guy was playing the what do you call that? The violin, and it was beautiful. And as long as he focused on the music, people came around and they were listening to him, and it launched into this, that, and I mean, just a huge crowd. But he had to stay with the music. The first time he had just kind of improvised or gotten off, or people would have started to. You have to dance for an audience of one. That audience, we want God's approval. But in the process, if you'll do that by respecting God, and you're going to find that other people are going to gather to you. Now, what do you do with them? Well, you just diss them because they're not important. No, you respect them because they've gathered in the same location, seeking God. Powerful stuff, son.
Well, thank you. All right, again, for our SBS students, here's your questions. So you can do whatever you need to do with those and get the answers to those so that you can pass your quiz.
That's right. You don't want to fail.
Whatever you have, yeah.
That's right. Now let's before you shut this down, let's remind them. Next time we will be live again, but it's the time after that and the time after that we will. And we'll remind you next time. But stay tuned. Next time we will be live right here. But we'll have to give you 2 recordings after that because the man's going on mission trips.
Yep. All right.
Good job.
Thank you.
Good to see you guys.
All right, we'll see you next week. And I think we're talking about Mount Carmel. So that should be interesting.
Fireballs from heaven. Love that story.